Okay, welcome to another Women in Conservation Wednesday. Today I am joined with Molly Kressler, who focuses her studies on marine behavioural ecology. So, hi Molly.
Hi.
Okay, so let's get right into it. So the first thing I kind of wanted to ask was if you could provide a little bit of background, just maybe on your studies, where you studied, what you studied, and such, so that we can have a background sort of build up to
Yeah,
it.
definitely. So I'm from New Jersey in the US originally.
Oh.
And when I was applying to school, to universities, I, in a kind of rare incident, knew what I wanted to study pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
I have grandparents who live in Florida, and so my whole kind of life up to that point I had spent in New Jersey and down on the east coast of Florida, and so I knew I was really intrigued by marine things, especially mangroves and that kind of coastal habitat. But then I was also always really intrigued by behavior and the motivations of people for why they did things, and at the time I didn't realize there was this kind of field of marine behavioral ecology, and so I was looking at schools that had strong marine bio programs as well as behavioral programs.
Yep.
But I did have a general sense of what I wanted to do, and so I found the University of St Andrews in Scotland and ended up going there for all 4 years of my undergrad, and I just loved it. And I was able to do a marine biology degree, and then you do a thesis in your fourth year, a lot like how you do at Exeter in your third year, and I was able to do it on some sticklebacks and study their behavior and look at how personality affected their susceptibility to be caught in a trap.
Oh.
And from there, I kind of networked through some people I had worked with in St Andrews, and ended up working in Germany for a year.
Mm-hmm.
It's also worth noting that in between years at St Andrews, I got to work at the Bimini Biological Field Station, which is more commonly referred to as Bimini Shark Lab.
Yeah. Which
was a really amazing experience, and I'm really grateful for it, and it equipped me with a lot of field skills that still to this day I use and are useful in my career.
Mm-hmm.
But I worked in Germany for a year, working again with a small fish and a kind of behavioral ecology setup.
Yeah.
And in that time, as the fates have it, I shared an office with someone who I shared a bunk bed with in Bimini.
Oh.
Her name's Felicie Dellum, and she's another amazing female scientist in the kind of marine ecology and behavior world.
Mm-hmm.
And when I had been in Bimini, I had actually been helping her work on her doctoral thesis that she was completing in Germany, because the world is very small. And she was really integral in helping me write a PhD proposal looking at juvenile shark behavior in the Bahamas. And that's kind of the quick version of how I ended up here. I wrote that proposal, found some funding from external sources for it, and then applied to Exeter.
Mm-hmm.
And I originally emailed Dave Hodgson,
Yeah.
the head of department, because I was really interested in the statistical approaches he was using and talking about. And he said, I would love to, but I don't necessarily have the capacity for this, but I have a new lecturer who I think would be great for this. And that's how I got in contact with Rich Shirley, who's my current supervisor. And he's really great. He's like a population demographer and studies penguins in South Africa, as well as a lot of other things. He's developed and worked with a lot of the IUCN assessment stuff for sharks.
Yeah.
So there was a definite interest overlap there, and that's kind of how I ended up where I am, yeah.
That's so interesting. So you've done quite a lot of traveling and such then.
I have, yes.
Was deciding to do all of this traveling, was that like a difficult decision, or was it sort of I saw this opportunity and I have to go for it immediately?
Yeah, I think it's funny, the opportunities always kind of came out of my own networking and my own hunt, and so they never felt immediate and they never felt pressing.
Mm-hmm.
But the great thing was that I, for some reason, felt the courage to go do them. And the traveling was, I look back on it now and I think, how did I move so much? But I'm glad I did. I think working in so many different places with so many different people has really given me a lot of perspective early on in my career, which still helps in the work that I do.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, thank you so much for giving us a little bit of backstory.
Yeah.
So I want to focus a little bit more now on what you're currently doing and what your work is.
Yeah.
So could you give us an overview of what your current project that you're working on is?
Sure. So I'm working with some historical data sets from the Bimini Shark Lab, looking at the movement and spatial behavior of the juvenile lemon sharks.
Yeah.
So this population in Bimini is pretty special. It's natally philopatric, which means that similar to sea turtles, adult pregnant females come back to the same mangrove estuary that they were born in to give birth to their pups. And another layer of that is that this species of shark has what's called polyandry.
Yeah.
So the cohorts of sharks themselves are really pretty genetically diverse, because you'll have multiple fathers who have contributed to a single pupping cohort, we call it. I love that they're called pups. It's really endearing. And what's also special about Bimini is it's got this interconnected mangrove forest estuary system. With mangrove leading to seagrass beds and then sand flat. It's kind of the classic picture that you get taught about in undergrad. So it's cool to see in person, but then it's an added layer of uniqueness is that the juvenile sharks stay there for about 5 to 7 years until they're nearly 2 meters in length. And so what I'm doing is looking at some of the ecological drivers that drive this habitat selection and drive this dependency on this habitat. And so I'm looking at everything like habitat type to prey resource distribution, and what is kind of known as a landscape of fear is quite a common topic in terrestrial literature. It's this idea about how predator distribution affects prey distribution.
Yeah.
And so looking at that, because the juvenile lemon sharks, while they might be the predator to smaller mangrove-associated species, they are a great energetic snack for a larger shark. And Bimini, being so close to the Gulf Stream in the North Atlantic, has very resident large elasmobranchs rings and also transient elasmobranchs rings that use the Bahamas as kind of an energetic stopover. So that's kind of the elevator pitch of what I'm doing. I'm trying to tease apart some of those relationships and look at how juvenile space use relates to that, because understanding zooming out from Bimini on a broader context, kind of trying to understand a bit more about these species at this vulnerable life stage might allow us to better target protection measures, and which will hopefully help with recruitment, because catch limits and things like that on adults are great, but we also need to make sure that the populations are recruiting. And so we need to try and figure out what drives that recruitment behavior and that recruitment success. So that's kind of where my thesis fits in the bigger picture of it all.
That's so fascinating. That's such a really interesting topic. So looking at it then, and obviously you've said about like using it in the bigger picture, in terms of what you're doing currently and what you know that you're able to do, what would you say are the main aims of this project? Yeah,
so the first one is having kind of come up in my career so much in the kind of behavioral ecology sphere. When I started looking and delving more into marine ecology, I realized that there tends to be, because of a historic limitation on technology and our capacity to kind of explore the oceans, a limit in terms of what we can study in regards to marine vertebrate behavior. So the first aim of my thesis is to try and provide a framework and a kind of workflow and perspective that folds in some of these principles of behavioral ecology into marine ecology. There are these things we call like first principles, and it's this idea that you go back to basics and you assume nothing. And I think that if we can do that in marine vertebrate ecology, we'll actually be able to learn a lot more about the interconnectedness of individuals as well as communities in the seas. And I think that's integral to blue conservation.
Yeah.
The other aims are to kind of get a better picture of this population in the Bahamas. There's a bit of marine spatial management that we're going to suggest that I can't talk about at this time, but hopefully someday soon I'll be able to talk more about it. But kind of making some recommendations, some updated recommendations for areas that are of critical use to the species. And then as well just contributing to the literature on how a vulnerable stage of marine vertebrate, of shark, there's lots of literature about how globally they're threatened and especially locally threatened, how their behavior at such a young, vulnerable age relates to their environment.
Yeah.
So those are kind of the big aims.
Okay, that's so interesting. So, sort of linking back to it, I know you've obviously stated about how you hope it will be used in the bigger picture and such. From those aims and from everything that you know that you're able to achieve, how do you ultimately hope that the project that you're doing will benefit the conservation sector?
Yeah, I think on a local level, there's been a lot of stalemating in terms of protections. Bimini in the Bahamas was registered as a shark sanctuary almost a decade ago, I think. Hopefully I have that right. But the thing with the shark sanctuary is there's been some discussion in kind of the international shark research sphere about how it's really great in terms of outreach and community engagement, but it's not the most practical approach to applied conservation. Early in the 2000s, there was a protected area suggested for Bimini, and then it's never been enacted or enforced. And while fishing isn't the number one threat to these juveniles, habitat degradation and removal is. And the mangroves of Bimini, year on year, if you look at satellite imagery, which is available on Google Earth, if anyone's interested, you can see more and more coastal development in their primary habitat area. And so I kind of hope that we'll be able to make some suggestions and make some amendments to that initial plan for conservation for a protected area that maybe kind of narrows the goal and makes the goal more realistic about what we can protect in that habitat as a bare minimum. And then from a larger picture, this idea that I have about injecting a bit more of behavioral first principles into marine ecology, I think is probably the biggest impact I'd like to have on a broader scale. I think that we can learn a lot from their behavior and from applying these behavioral theories that have come from decades of research in the laboratory and in terrestrial environments. If we apply those to marine vertebrates, I think we can learn a lot more about not only within species and within populations, but the interconnectedness of them, and hopefully apply them in a way that has had so much success. I think a really great example of this actually comes from the University of Exeter and work done by, I think her name is, I really hope I don't get this wrong, Elena Bersacola and Kimberly Hawkins. They did some work with chimpanzees in, I think, Guinea-Bissau. Again, I hope I'm not getting that wrong. And I think it's just a really beautiful case study of using spatial behavior, both of humans and a wild vertebrate, with a conservation focus and looking at teasing apart the relationship between the spatial behavior of those chimps and their resources, which are fruit trees and different vegetative habitats, and then kind of interpreting that in a behavioral context with a focus on applying it for conservation. And I think that we can learn a lot from that in the marine sphere, whereas a lot of times our approach, because we've had historic limitations on what we can do, our approach has been how many, where, and when. And I think we now have the technology and the capacity to ask more questions, more types of questions.
That's so fascinating, thank you. So I wanted to sort of ask, because obviously you seem incredibly passionate about this, and it's obviously something that you are taking incredibly seriously. Would you say, when you were doing research into this and preparation, I suppose, would you say that it was a particularly understudied sort of area, or was it something that you found abundance of information? And if it was understudied, did that kind of inspire you a little bit more to go forth with it?
Yeah, I think whether something is studied or understudied is so relative, but I think that compared to the amount of behavioral facing research that was being done in the terrestrial and laboratory environment to the marine environment, and freshwater as well, is much smaller, relatively, comparatively. And so when I was looking into it, I was at first like disheartened, because when you're a young researcher, we kind of go by example. It can be really, and I don't think it's always good to try and blaze a new path. I think that like the things that have worked sometimes work for a reason. And but I also, though, in the marine literature, saw glimmers of this approach. There's a lot of work done with the narwhals and the killer whales up in Canada and the Arctic, looking at fear-related responses, and there's some of it down in South Africa with great whites and killer whales there, white sharks. And I saw these kind of glimmers of kind of introducing these concepts of predator-prey interactions, and that kind of gave me this idea that, okay, I'm on the right track here. This is something that we can try to start to do. And I talked to people about it, and I said, this is my idea, what do you think of it? And I think that was really valuable, especially, I'm a self-proposed PhD, so it's called self-generated. And I found kind of being vulnerable and saying, this is the idea I've had, can you try and pick it apart a little bit, really valuable, because it made me acknowledge where in the literature something was done to a point, and then what would I do next with it?
Yeah.
I think is kind of how I got to it. I think I kind of answered your question in that, but I think I was the glimmers of it being, of this method, this approach, were kind of fuel for me to say, okay, this is an angle, this is a direction we should try and head in.
Yeah.
And then my interest as well. I've always been fascinated with kind of the apparent transient nature of sharks and of fish, and yet how they're reliably in a place, like this idea that fishermen know where the fish go.
Yeah.
Like, well, how can we know where the fish are going? And it made me think, okay, there must be something going on that allows this repeatability. And in kind of laboratory behavioral stuff, repeatability is king. And so it was this idea that there might be a way to kind of look into that a little bit. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to kind of, you told us so much about what you want to do, and that's amazing. That's exactly what we wanted. I wanted to, obviously, because we're women in conservation, wanted to focus a little bit more about being a woman in conservation, just in general. So, in terms of obviously being a woman in conservation, would you say that you found that has sort of impacted you in any way? Maybe impacted your ambitions, your career? Maybe it was ranging from any scale, so ranging from a professional or perhaps a personal scale. Would you say it impacted you at all?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. So I think another key factor for me is that I'm a woman in science, but I'm also a disabled woman in science. And so my experience has always been kind of the result of the interaction of the two. So I say that when I reflect on it, the biggest issue for me was always people's assumptions of my capacity, both as first a woman, and then upon closer inspection, or their closer inspection, a disabled woman. And a disabled person, and double whammy, a disabled woman from a lot of people's perspective. I think that I had a really warm and supportive upbringing in that I was always enabled. My parents helped me pursue sports, and if I struggled physically to achieve something, I was given the support needed to achieve it. And so I think that my experiences in science and facing this kind of bias of, oh, can a woman do it? Can I do it? I kind of met with the same energy of, well, surely I can. And I was really lucky when I got to St. Andrews. I had a professor who I quickly kind of latched onto as a mentor, Professor Susan Healy, and she's a genius in the behavioural ecology world, especially with her hummingbirds. And she was always so supportive but very realistic about the challenges of being a woman in science. And I think, it's a tricky one, because sometimes the bias and it's not always apparent. It's when you realize you're the only woman in the room, or you're the only young woman in the room, and then you start to maybe feel, do I belong here? Because there's no one else who looks like me, who is presenting as a female in this room. And that those moments can kind of, even when you have confidence, can kind of knock you off kilter. And then from there, it's very much about how you recover from that knock and how you recover from that feeling. I think something that I struggle with on a daily level is how I present myself. I love clothes, and I love to look put together, and I almost feel embarrassed to admit that out loud, but I actually have an aunt, and something she said has really helped me come to grips with this, because the crux of the issue is this idea that to succeed I must fit in.
Yeah.
And men ecologists have a very particular kind of look sometimes. There's this idea that if you dress up too much, you must not be good at what you do.
Yeah.
You must not be a good ecologist because you're not like ready to go into the field at any moment. And so that's kind of at the base of this anxiety that I have. Well, if I put some makeup on today, or if I wear something nicer, are people going to take me less seriously because of it? If I wear jewelry, am I going to be taken less seriously? And my aunt is actually the first, Auntie Eleanor. Eleanor is the first woman in my family to get a PhD. And not only is she the first woman, she worked in ornithology on the West Coast for decades, and then decided to go back and do her PhD. So not only was she a woman, but she was a mature woman doing it. And something she said, I don't even know if she knows that I know this, but she said to my mom once, one of the things I regret is not making more of an effort about my clothes. She's like, because I love fashion and I love to look nice. And I always let the pressure of being the woman in the room trying to blend into the men override my sense of self when it came to fashion. I'm paraphrasing, but that was the gist of the emotion. And to hear that come from a woman who's fought her way up through the ornithology world on the west coast of the U.S., which is male-dominated and intense, and to be successful and to hear that regret that she has, it really switched that anxiety that I have off almost, or it allowed me to say, no, you know what, being a woman and looking like one is fine. It almost has a power to it. Kind of this idea that if I just show who I am, and if that's with my clothes or my jewelry or my makeup, it doesn't mean I'm taken as less than. And just kind of finding the power to overcome that. So I think it almost seems trivial, but in my day-to-day, that is the thing that I most come up against. Is finding a balance between how I present myself and how people perceive me. I think it's something that's really empowering to get to a point where you're able to say, this is me, this is how I look, this is how I want to look, and whether you like it or not, I'm not going to change to try and fit in. And it's super powerful, I think, as well, when you then stand up in front of a room who maybe prejudge, and then you still deliver good science. And you deliver well-thought science. And I think it's kind of a boost to the self to be able to do that. I'm trying.
Sort of the shock on all of their faces is like the most satisfying thing ever, I can imagine.
It's and I almost hope that one day that I won't even think about it. I'll put on the necklace, I'll put on the makeup, and I won't think, oh, is it too much? I'll just do it. We're not quite there yet, but
I think it'll be nice to get to that day as well, when you present it and they're not shocked. And they're not they don't have these premonitions of oh, she's coming in and she's dressed like that, so she's obviously not going to be a good scientist, she's just trying to look like one.
And I think the other thing is it's important to know that like not everybody thinks that way, but I think it's just part of unconscious bias, I think. And I think it's part of the package of breaking down the unconscious bias when it comes to femininity in science and presenting as a female in science. So
I tend to find it really awful as well, because sometimes, like you said, it's an unconscious bias, and sometimes you can feel these things yourself. Sometimes you can like see a woman and be like, oh, she's dressed up like pretty much like really highly, and you, I guess, I don't know, conditioned to almost think away. And when I hate the feeling of being shocked by a smart woman. I think that like there should be no shock at all.
I agree. It's a bit of unconditioning I think everybody needs to go through. And I think just with time and practice and repeat exposure.
Okay. Well, that's great. Thank you so much for talking about that. So I've got 2 more questions left.
Cool.
So I wanted to ask, just in general, what would you say is your favourite memory from working in conservation?
Ooh.
A little bit of a difficult one.
That is so hard.
I imagine. Especially because you've done so much.
I know. I think I think I've got two contrasting moments.
Okay.
So, one of them is the first time I snorkeled with blue sharks.
Oh.
It was just in that classic person goes diving with sharks moment. It was just like, to anyone who's seen a blue shark, you know what I'm talking about. The glimmer on them, the color, the curiosity in the eyes. It was just like so affirming and so magical.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget that first look that I got at them coming up. It was kind of a murky day, coming up from the deep, just looking at me. And the blue and the glimmer, and it was amazing.
Yeah.
And so I think that experience was really great. But I think one of the most affirming experiences I ever had was when I finished at Germany and I was writing proposals to PhD programs. And when you apply, you have to give letters of recommendation and all this. And in Bimini, I worked for kind of a team, but one of kind of my go-to person on the team was Dr. Kate Laskowski, who's now an associate professor at UC Davis in the U.S. Another amazing woman in science, in behavioural ecology, and just a beautiful human being, and generous and kind, and gives so much of herself and so much of her time. And I asked her if she could write me a letter of recommendation because I had the most kind of contact time with her.
Yeah.
And she wrote, and and normally you don't get to see these letters. Normally you ask them, they draft one, and then as you send off applications, they get like an invite to post it.
Yeah.
But about a week later, she sent me an email, and she said, "Hi Molly, it's all drafted and ready for whenever you want to write send off an application. Just let me know when I should expect a link. That way I can watch, in case it goes to spam. Things always go to spam."
Yeah.
And she's like, she went on in the email, and she said, someone did this once for me when I was kind of at your point, and it was really valuable, and so I make it a practice now, that I'm going to send you what my recommendation letter is, because I think it's really important to acknowledge kind of what you've done well, and to get that feedback, because so many, you're probably in the PhD process, in the publication process, you get told no, too many times to count. You get told this is a bad idea too many times to count, even when it's a good idea, right? So it was this idea of, she said, I like to try and bolster people. Yeah. And in it, it was one of the most glowing things I have ever read about someone. It was about me. It wasn't like Molly's a great person or... it was about my work. And it was the first time somebody had, like in written form, somebody had told me, you are on the right track and you are doing the right thing and you are good at what you do. Yeah. And I think when you are kind of battling that imposter syndrome, it's important to keep that in mind. And I actually keep it taped up on the wall behind my desk at home. And whenever I'm home, I give it a read and I'm like, oh yeah, there we go. As a nice little boost. And so I think, there are other women in my career who have said things to me before that have been of that kind of boost, but it was kind of the physicalness of a letter. And also the impact. That letter I was sending off to potential supervisors and to institutions and doctoral colleges, and I felt so confident sending it because I knew it's just a confidence boost that I think you need. And so I think that was one of the most amazing moments. I wish I could say it was like when I discovered something in my science, but my science is still quite young. But I think there are amazing moments like that. But I think the thing that keeps me coming back to this field and keeps me going is knowing that there are people who think my contribution is valuable. Yeah. And then also the other side of it, of these animals are beautiful and they have a curiosity to them, and they have a behavior that isn't just I swim here, I eat that. There's more to them. Yeah. And that curiosity about them and what makes them is those two things acting together kind of bring me back. Definitely. Having that sort of affirmation from someone that I guess you could view as a role model, and someone that inspires you has got to be I can completely understand why that's one of your best moments. Yeah. Truly. I'm sure that, like you mentioned, your science is very young, but based on everything you've talked about and how in depth you've gone into it and how evidently passionate about it you are, I think you're going to have some really amazing scientific discoveries in the future. So final question, and then we're done. Do you have any tips for anyone listening who is wanting to go into conservation? Because it's pretty competitive. It is very competitive. Pretty difficult. So do you have any things that really helped you, or things that you've learned from your journey that you wish you knew before? Yeah. I've got some, I fear some may be a bit generic, but I think, I'm doing a podcast right now, but I'm not like a naturally very extroverted person. I've learned this. And I think encouraging yourself to learn to communicate and networking with people is the number one thing that has helped my career. I met Kate Laskowski and ended up working in Germany because she came and gave a talk at a journal club, like a small group at my university, so it was like a subgroup of a subgroup. And I talked to her after, and then I email hounded her for weeks after. And I think I would say encouraging yourself to learn to communicate, even if it feels like it is the most foreign thing in the world to you. Because it is a crucial skill, not just in communicating your science, but in getting the job that lets you do your science. I think I would also say, in terms of kind of more career stuff, sphere of things, I think flexibility is really important. I always had this itching about mangroves and sharks, and now that's what I'm doing, and I'm really lucky and really fortunate to do that. But I think I got here because along the way I allowed myself to take detours into side areas and allowed that flexibility. Like in Germany, I was doing nothing comparable in hypothesis-wise to what I'm doing now. I mean, a little bit. There's a parallel, but they're on completely different train tracks. And if I had been so dead set on doing something with sharks immediately, I don't think I would be where I am now, which is exactly where I wanted to be when I was 16. Which is mental. Not everybody has that. It's not achievable for everybody, and I'm so lucky that I do, but I think I got here because of that flexibility. And so I think sometimes giving up you're going to feel like you might be giving up on your goal or your dream species, but I think it actually allows you to get back to it because you're going to learn skills along the way. So I think flexibility and pushing yourself to learn to communicate. And to find, if you're not a natural communicator, you're probably never going to be like super duper comfy with it. But finding a place where you can do it and where you can do it without causing yourself stress or extreme stress. We all get nervous before a talk, even the professors do. But reaching a place where you feel comfortable.
Sort of having that flexibility, but never settling.
Exactly.
Just perseverance.
Perseverance in it, and realizing that your career is an accumulation of skill and an accumulation of people and community and networking. And if you actually focus on building your skills and your community, your science will grow because of it, and you'll find yourself facilitated by your community and your skills to do whatever it is that you want to do. I think those are the two. When people, I try and mentor students where I can, and that's what I always say is build those skills and talk to everybody you can. And you don't need to, say the most mind-blowing thing, but it's just, I think the consistency with which you do it, you'll find you end up meeting more people and having more meaningful conversations.
Okay. Well, that's it. So thank you so much for joining me today.
No worries. It was fun. It was nice.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
No worries.